I think this is a really important topic, and it's a really fun topic because it touches on microeconomics, macroeconomics, resource economics, public policy. So it really gets into a lot of the subjects that I particularly love. Yes, we need to talk closer. Okay. And I met a couple of students last night who I know are resource economics specialties. And I'd like to just ask a few questions about your specialties just so I have a better sense. How many of you are studying natural resource economics? We just have a show of hands. Okay, we have 2 or 3 of those. How about microeconomics? Microeconomic theory, say. Okay. What about labor economics? Okay, a few of those. Macroeconomics or monetary economics? We have quite a few of those. Some people putting their hands up twice, that's okay. Ben has put his hands up twice already, so. What about econometrics? How many of you studying econometrics? Okay. What about social choice economics or public economics? We have some of those. Behavioral economics? Okay, we need to have some comments from the behavioral folks today during our discussion because I think behavioral economics applies well to this topic. Industrial organization, IO. What else? International economics, either finance or trade. Okay, so what other fields am I forgetting? I don't know whether we have accountants or finance people. Okay. What was it?
Experimental economics.
Experimental economics? Okay. All right. So this is good. So the good news is that we're going to have a discussion of energy today, and it's going to basically touch every single one of these subjects that you're studying, because economics of energy touches everything. This is a field that I have been following for about 30 years since I did my own dissertation in the early 1980s. At that time, we had an energy crisis, and energy was on everyone's minds, and so I did a energy modeling study for my own dissertation. And I've been very interested in energy economics for, as I say, for about 30 years. I was a student at the University of Pennsylvania. I did macroeconomics with Albert Ando and Robert Schiller, and I did econometric modeling with Larry Klein and Jerry Adams. So that's my background, and I spent much of my career doing macroeconomic modeling, and in particular doing policy-related work based on that modeling. I have to say, I've not had the traditional career that your other speakers have had today. I've not been a researcher my whole life. I started my career in the academic world teaching some macroeconomics at the very beginning, but I then worked in public policy a good chunk of my years. As Ricardo said, I was at the Council of Economic Advisors in the Clinton administration. I was also at the National Economic Council as special assistant to the President for Economic Policy at the White House for a few years. So I did that. I was at the International Monetary Fund. Now, yesterday's speaker, George Akerlof, is currently in the research department at the IMF. I spent part of my career in the research department at the IMF as well, part of the time in the European department at the IMF. So I really kind of bounced around and had a very non-traditional career. I have spent part of my career in the private sector at Wharton Econometrics, which was my mentor, Larry Klein and Jerry Adams' economic forecasting firm and model building firm. And for the last 12 years, I have a firm in Washington called Keybridge Research, and we're a boutique economic consulting firm. We're 13 employees. Our staff comes to us. One of our other people worked with me at the White House in the Clinton administration. One of our people was at the U.S. Treasury. One of our folks came to us from the Chief Economist's office at the World Bank. And we do high-level economic consulting. We have financial clients in Europe, Asia, North America. We have one of the big 3 energy companies in the world as a client. We give them strategic advice on economic issues. And so that's our business. And a lot of actually what we do in our business is kind of different from your world. We actually don't write a lot of things down. A lot of our advice is given in private briefings to CEOs on energy topics or oil pricing issues or what affects, where the world economy is going, those sorts of things. But we do write some studies. And one of the things I want to talk about today is some of the studies that I've worked on in the last few years on modeling energy policy scenarios. One of the studies that we did recently is looking at if America converted to electric vehicles, what would be the macroeconomic effects? And so I'll talk a little bit about that study. But that's kind of the world that I come from. I have to say, let me just lay my cards on the table as we start. I think that energy is a dominant macro event for the world economy. I think $100 oil is the dominant macro story of the last 7 years. And I think that it was the single most important cause of the 2008-9 recession, global recession. If you look at the timing of it, we got to $147 oil well before the Lehman crash, well before the financial meltdown. The world economy was in recession due to high oil prices, in my opinion, even before the financial sector crashed. So I think it was a very important event. I also think it's not a coincidence today that Europe is in recession, Japan is just coming out of recession, Brazil's been in recession, much of the world has been in recession. And I think it's interesting. I think analysts around the world go, oh, we don't know what the cause is. It must be uncertainty in Europe, and it must be this and that. They're grasping for explanations. And I think $100 oil is the dominant explanation for the slow world growth the last 4 years. So we'll get into that. Anyway, I do think it's important. Let me just put it this way. I think the world can adapt to any price of oil. It can adapt to $50 oil, $100 oil, $200 oil. But it takes an adjustment process. And I think that we're about 1/3 of the way into an adjustment to $100 oil. And so we're seeing many of the negative consequences for the oil-consuming countries right now. I think eventually the world can adapt to any price, but I think this is one of the key factors shaping the world economy, which of course makes it interesting to talk about today. Now, a lot has been written about oil and energy, and my friend Dan Yergin has written a 1,000-page book called The Prize. Maybe you've seen that book. He's come up with a new book in the last year or so, another 1,000-page book called The Quest. And the purpose of this class today is to give you kind of the 3-hour Cliff Notes version of The Quest, okay? So we're going to talk about some of the trends that Dan identifies in his book, and we're going to talk about how oil is affecting the world economy, what some of the geopolitics of oil and so on are. But this is not going to be the 1,200-page version of it, okay? This is going to be the 3-hour version of it. This little thing here. And I apologize, I know some of you cannot see all these slides well, but I'll be reading the important parts to you, or highlighting the important parts of this. This is our agenda for today. I'd like to start by just going over some of my goals for the class. I'd then like to go into a quick, I call it a fact-based overview of oil. McKinsey likes to do what they call fact-based analysis. Rather than getting into opinions and all this, you just start with the facts. And so we're going to start with some facts so that we all have a knowledge base that we can use for our discussion for the next 3 hours. I'd then like to just spend a few minutes on the natural resource curse question. This is because it interests me, and I think it's a fascinating fascinating question. By the way, development economics. How many of you do development economics? I apologize, I forgot to ask about that question. Okay, good. I'd then like to go on, and the heart of the talk today is going to be on who determines the price of oil. And so we're going to talk about that, and that's kind of the core microeconomics of oil, and in particular a non-market priced commodity like oil. It's going to be there's some interesting things to talk about there. We're then going to go on and talk about how oil prices affect a macroeconomy. And this is one of my particular passions for my career, is thinking about how oil prices interact with macroeconomics. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk about policy options that could protect an economy from oil shocks. And we have some modeling work that I've done in this area. We'll talk about a couple of things on this front. And then we have time for class discussion. So is that a good agenda for today, do you think? Okay, good. My goals for the class, my goals for today. I'd like to just make sure you're aware of some new trends in global oil markets. And there are some very interesting new trends in oil markets. That's one of the reasons why I call it an energy revolution. That was the title of the class. I want to talk again about this natural resource curse debate. Again, this is not going to be a real detailed discussion. This is going to be the 5-minute version of the natural resource curse debate. And then, as I said, I'd like to talk about microeconomic drivers of oil prices, including the optimal behavior for a partial monopolist. And a partial monopolist, to me, does capture the oil market. This is not a globally competitive, a free market in oil, but no one controls the whole market. And so OPEC, for example, is a partial monopolist. It controls part of the market. Then I'd like to move on, as I mentioned, about macroeconomics. I'd like to make sure we have an understanding of the main channels through which oil prices affect a macroeconomy. So we'll talk about that, and then discuss policy options that we could take to insulate an economy from oil shocks. So that's the goals for the class today. And let's just start right off with our fact-based overview of oil. And the first question is, and I've designed this around about 6 or 8 very basic questions, but where is oil? Okay, that's the first question. And this is a map of the world you're not used to seeing, because the size of countries in this map have been scaled to the extent that they have oil resources. So you see North America over there on the far left is pretty small, because North America has about 2% of the world's proven oil resources. And you see Saudi Arabia is pretty big, because they have about 1/4 of the world's oil resources. And then other countries, Iran, Iraq, both have about 10% world oil resources. And then you see a lot of other big countries, like you didn't think Kuwait was really that big, but it actually is in terms of oil resources. Venezuela is the only really big country in the Western Hemisphere. Otherwise, it's a bunch of very small countries. And you don't really see Australia and much of Asia on the map either. You see China is very small as well. Japan doesn't exist on this map. And even Russia is much smaller than you might have thought. So this is basically looking at where oil is. How many students in the class come from oil exporting countries? 1, 2, 3. So we have about 7 or 8 from oil exporting. You're putting your hand up a little bit, half, a little bit down. You're not quite sure. So, okay. Next question is, where is oil consumed? And the size of the circles here show who uses oil and how much they use. So we see a big red circle over on the left, that's the United States. Canada actually uses quite a bit, Mexico uses quite a bit. You see Asia over here with a big blue circle for China, a big blue circle for Japan, and then you see generally a bunch of medium-sized circles in Europe. If you add it all up, the world is using about 88 million barrels of oil a day. And just roughly speaking, 25 million barrels a day to North America, something like 20 million barrels a day to Europe, another 25 million barrels a day to Asia, including China, and then other smaller users around the world. But there's 3 big demand centers: Asia, Europe, North America, and that's where most of the world's oil is used. In terms of imbalance, my country, the US, would be one of the most imbalanced countries. About 2% of the world's endowment of oil or resources, proven reserves at this point, and about 25% of world demand. Yes?
Yes, I just want to clarify, in the previous chart, where you showed world's oil reserves, is that known reserves that are being tapped, or is that
Yes, those are proven reserves at this point, and you're actually anticipating where we're going to go next. Yes, a question here?
Important point is that those are conventional ones.
Yes, those are conventional, exactly. And we're going to, a big part of this talk today and this class today is going beyond conventionals. But yes, those are conventionals. And yes, Ben?
It's oil, not gas, right?
This is oil, not gas. Yeah. Okay, so this is, again, just some basics of where we're at. Now, I'm going to ask a very basic question. Where is the demand for oil rate increasing the fastest in the world today? China, okay. So, Ricardo, you said these guys were smart, and I see they really are. Yes, it is China. The yellow line here is oil demand in the OECD countries, so basically the 30 industrial countries. And the white line here is oil demand in the emerging market countries. And you can see that the two lines are getting ready to cross. Well, this data goes to 2012. Yes?
We just did.
Okay, they just did. This is 2013 in June or May, which, yeah. So, just to give one example, the U.S. oil demand was about 22 million barrels a day at the peak about 5 years ago, and we're down to about 18.5 million barrels a day of oil demand. So, U.S. has fallen about 4 million barrels, almost 4 million barrels a day of oil demand in the last 5 years since the Great Recession. China's basically in that time gone up about 4 million barrels a day, just roughly speaking. So, now, this chart here shows oil demand in some of the key emerging market countries. This is China, this is Brazil, and this is India. And the blue at the top there, that's China. That's by far the biggest demander of oil in the world, and we're seeing the fastest growth there. There's a very interesting thing you can do. And there's a very strong regularity in data. If you're interested, I suggest you get this data and look at this. Look at automobile ownership by per capita income level, and you will see a regularity around the world that is stunning. Basically, with countries with less than $3,000 per capita, no one can afford an automobile. At $3,000 per capita, you start to get 1 in 100 people can afford an automobile. As you go up to like $4,000, you get 1 in 50 people can afford an automobile. The sweet spot for automobile ownership in the world is between about 5,000 per capita and about 9,000 per capita. And in that range, automobile ownership goes from about 1 in 50 to 1 in 10 to 1 in 5. And so what you see is you get to a sweet spot in terms of per capita income, where per capita income goes up by like 80%, but automobile ownership goes up by like 500%. And so when a country moves through that range in terms of per capita income, that's when oil demand really increases sharply. And China is moving through that range right now, and it's basically going from 1 in 100 to 1 in 50 to 1 in 20 to 1 in 10 to 1 in 5. That's the kind of path that China's on right now. And when that happens, that's when your oil demand goes from 2 million to 4 million to 6 million to 10 million barrels a day, and that's where China is today. Now, several of you pointed out that was conventional oil, and we're going to just talk for a minute about unconventional oil. Conventional oil is basically liquid, it's in the ground and you can pump it out, and you can pump it from onshore sources or offshore sources, but that's conventional oil. And increasingly we're finding unconventional oil. Unconventional oil requires some unconventional technology to extract it. So it means that you basically need to either heat it or dilute it to get it out of the ground. And we have a couple of key types of unconventional oil. One is oil sands, or tar sands, and so this would be like, these are sediments composed of sand, clay material, and so on. And an example here would be the Canadian tar sands. Another form of unconventional is oil shale. And the example of this would be like Harrigan, which is something that they have a lot of in Russia. And a third source of unconventional oil is shale oil. And some people call this tight oil. And this is a form of oil that can be produced from shale reservoirs. And an example of this is in North America, like in North Dakota. We're doing a lot of extracting of oil, of shale oil. We're using fracturing technology, the same technology that we've been using for about the last 10 years to produce gas, we're now using to produce oil. And just to give you a number, the U.S. domestic oil production, liquid oil production, was about 5 million barrels a day 4 years ago, and we're now up to 7 million barrels a day, 2012. The production of tight oil is increasing faster than all estimates. Every estimate says, oh, maybe we'll add 500 million barrels a day to U.S. production, and we're actually getting like 1 million barrels a day of additional production. So in 2012, U.S. domestic oil production increased by the largest amount in American history. It went up more than 1 million barrels a day. So there is a lot of oil that you can extract from these unconventional techniques, and that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this today, is this is kind of changing the energy story. So this says, where is unconventional oil found? Where are these unconventional reserves around the world? And you can see China has some, Russia has some. The International Energy Agency just came up with their estimates of where unconventional reserves were around the world. And some of the biggest unconventional reserves are in Canada and the United States. And so that's kind of interesting, and you can see this is a little bit changing the map. When I said that we were redrawing the map, that the energy revolution could be redrawing the map, this picture captures it pretty well. One of the interesting things, this fracturing technology, you basically force high pressure water and chemicals into the ground, and you pulverize the shale formations, and you release these gas. In the case of gas, you release natural gas. In the case of oil, you release oil. It takes a lot of water to do fracturing as we do it today. And so you not only need to have a place where you have these formations, but you also need to have a lot of water that you can use. So China, for example, has some pretty substantial formations of both gas and oil in these shale formations, but many of these are in very dry areas where there's not a lot of water. And so there is a question of how much of these reserves can be exploited if you don't have a lot of water. We also have a lot of gas in California, for example. Basically everything between Los Angeles and San Francisco is a shale gas formation. We do not have a lot of water in California either. And so one of the big things now in the energy sector is trying to experiment with additional ways of fracturing that do not require a lot of water. And so we're going to see where that technology goes. But these are some of the issues that are going on in this unconventional space. Next question, yes?
Sorry, going back to the fracking, I don't know how long it's been done in the US. It's something that was recently sort of approved in South Africa, in an area where there's not water really, and it's the whole thing of the area is farming and everyone relies on groundwater that gets polluted by this. I sort of think it is increasing your energy then at the cost of damaging the, it's not green, it's, because it's damaging the water resources.
Yeah, so this is a huge issue, and we can talk about this for an afternoon, but the short answer is groundwater for the most part tends to be 100, 200, 300 feet below the surface of the earth. The reserves that we're fracturing for in, say, the Pennsylvania and New York and so on are thousands of feet deep. And so the industry will tell you that they can encase these drilling holes with cement, and that they're thousands of feet away from the drinking water. But that's a debate, and there's a huge debate on the safety factor of fracturing. And it is something that we have to take into account. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to some discussion a little later, because I'm curious to get your others' views on the safety of fracturing. Let me just talk now about what comes out of a barrel of oil. Again, just trying to set the fact base for our discussion. A barrel of oil is 42 gallons. And you basically have to refine oil. It's like a big chemistry set. You take a barrel of oil and you heat it, you inject chemicals into the process. This is part of the refining process. And out of the 42 gallons, typically you get about 20 gallons of gasoline. You typically get about 10 gallons of diesel fuel. You get some jet fuel. And then you get other blends off the barrel of oil, including something like asphalt that you can use for tarring roads. And so this is the output of a barrel of oil. There's some ability to change the mix of what you get from the refining process. For example, in the fall, when it's going to winter heating season, you can change the chemical inputs you make as you're doing the refining to make a little bit more home heating oil, for example, a little less gasoline. So you have some ability to shift the mix, but basically this is about what you get. About half of a barrel of oil comes out as gasoline in most refining processes. Now, quick question. Where do we use petroleum in an economy? What sectors do we use oil in? What's the biggest sector that uses oil in an economy?
Logistics.
What's that?
Logistics.
Okay, so some are saying manufacturing, logistics, petrochemicals, transportation. Okay. And this chart is too small for you to read in the back, but I'll tell you what the key points are. The top two on the left is the residential sector, and on the right is industrial. And those are on a scale of 0 to 12 quads of energy. This is of oil. And these are all four forms of energy, but these are quads. And so those are relatively small. Residential and industrial are both on a scale of 12 quads. And the bottom left is electrical power, and the bottom right is transportation. And those are on a scale of 25 to 30 quads. So most energy by far goes into the transportation sector and the electricity sector in an economy. We do use some for home heating, of course. We do use some for industrial uses. But most of it, the biggest sources, the biggest places we use energy are electric power and transportation. And if you look at what forms of energy we use for residential, it's natural gas. We heat homes with natural gas. We use some electricity. There's almost no oil being used in the residential sector. Very few homes are heated with oil these days. In the top right, the industrial sector still uses a good bit of oil, but natural gas is constantly rising as a share of the industrial sector, and electricity is constantly rising as a share of the industrial sector. And so coal is basically steadily falling as an input into the industrial sector. The really interesting stuff is at the bottom. The bottom left is the electric power sector. And of course, the biggest single user of energy is electrical waste. The heat rate for most electric power plants is about 1/3, can be as high as 42%. But that basically means about 2/3 of all the energy that's burned in a power plant goes up the air and smoke. In heat, is waste heat. And some great potential areas for gain if we can make electricity in a more efficient manner. Some natural gas combined cycle plants can be 50%, 55% efficient. If we can do combined heat and power, we can get 60 or even 70% efficiency in the electricity production, but that's the basic story. There's almost no oil in the world being used to produce electricity, with a few exceptions, because Japan has shut down almost all of its nuclear power plants. They're relying heavily on oil and imported gas to produce electricity, but that's one of the few places where there's been any increase in oil use for electricity. The real story here is the bottom right quadrant, which is the transportation sector. And virtually all of the transportation sector in the whole world is fueled by petroleum. And so that is really the dominant story here. There's just down at the very bottom, you see a tiny little electricity and natural gas going to the transportation sector, but for all intents and purposes, it rounds to 0. Now, next question. Yes?
I have a technical question about the graph.
Yes.
May I read it so that transportation is about twice as important as industrial? Because
Yes.
Because in the industrial I have a lot of lines, and if I sum them up, they are
I don't know, I have to do that. I'd have to go back and check that out. So I can't say offhand, because there were multiple components, you're right, and everything in transportation was oil, so, yeah. So now I want to ask you a question. I really want to see how smart you are. Think about the world's oil bill, okay? Think about what is the cost of oil divided by world GDP. Okay, that's a very simple form of the world's oil bill. Anyone have an idea of what that's running these days? Well, is it 1%, 10%, 20%? What do you think? 25? What do you think? 10%? Okay. You're a little high. It's about 4 or 5% these days. So if you take this is the world's oil bill. This is, again, the value of all the oil in the world divided by world GDP. And historically, before the first oil embargo in 1973, before OPEC really got going, the world's oil bill was about 1%. And then during the 73-74 period, it got up to about 4.5%, world's oil bill. In 1979, 80, 81, we got up to about 7%, the world's oil bill. Throughout the 1990s, the world's oil bill was running about 2% of world GDP. By the way, this was a boom period for the world economy. The 1990s, the world economy was doing quite well. Fast world GDP growth. So we know that periods of when the world's oil bill is on the order of 2%, the world economy can grow quite rapidly. Lately, in 2008, we got up again to 5% world's oil bill, and we've basically been about 5% ever since. So that's the world's oil bill. Next question. How much does a typical household pay? Well, I'm using data from the US. It's the easiest for me to get my hands on. And the average American household spends about 4.5% of its budget on oil, on gasoline for its cars. This is just about $3,000 per year the average American household spends for gasoline. Interestingly, they spend about the same amount on the automobile itself as on their fuel for the automobile. So another way of thinking of this, the average car costs something like $25,000, and the average person is going to put about $25,000 of fuel in that car while they own it. So basically, think about substitution of capital and labor and energy. Okay, well, we use about $25,000 of capital to get to where we want to go, and we use about $25,000 of fuel over a 10-year period to get where we want to go. So that's kind of the decision, that's kind of the way the technology has stacked up in the past. Now, I contend it's going to be very different in the future. We're going to spend a lot more on capital, and we're going to spend less on fuel in the future, but we're going to get into that. Next question, who owns the world's oil?
Governments.
Governments, you're exactly right. In the 1960s, it might have been Exxon and Chevron and Texaco and so on, and Shell and BP that owned the world's oil. But today, they only own about 15% of the world's oil. About 15% is privately owned, and about 85% is owned by governments. So it's either state oil companies or direct government ownership, but basically about 85% is controlled directly by governments. Okay? This chart here shows who produces the most oil in the world. And again, you may not see it at the back, but Saudi Aramco is at the top, producing about 9% of the world's oil. The National Iranian Oil Company is about 4% of global production. We get to the Mexican oil company, State Oil Company, 3%. We got down to here before we get to BP, which is the largest private sector. The gray ones are the private sector firms. And so basically there's BP, and there's ExxonMobil, and that's Chevron. This is the Russian oil. And down here we have Shell and Total down here. But basically almost, the biggest producers by far are national oil companies. And so this is a phrase we hardly even knew 20 years ago or 25 years ago, which was national NOC. It was always the IOCs, the integrated oil companies were the big, they were the ones that ran the world's oil business. Today it's the NOCs, and so this is just the changing nature of ownership of oil. Another question, how is energy use related to economic development? This is just a general question. If you have faster economic development or more economic development, what do you do? What happens to your energy use? Positive relationship. Yeah. And so here's just some data that shows, this is on the y-axis, we have energy use per capita, and on the right we have the level of, this is a UN Human Development Index, but you basically see countries like the US and Finland and Luxembourg and Norway up here at the top use lots of oil, have high per capita income, and you see India, Morocco, Indonesia, and so on at lower levels of energy use by far. And so basically, if we were to put a regression line through there, it would be upward sloping to the right. But I think I just wanted to show you that the things that you kind of know, can be confirmed by data. So that's what we're doing here right now. Okay, so let's move on and talk now. That was just a quick overview of some data. I just wanted to kind of get some things out there just so we have a common understanding. Yes, in the back?
I just want to clarify, so you said about 85% of the world oil is owned by governments and 15% privately by corporations. Is that also true for the United States?
No, for the U.S. it would be very different. So in the U.S. it's mostly privately owned. Yeah, there is a lot of pumping on public lands even in the United States, but some of the biggest oil fields in the U.S. have played out. So Alaska was producing about 1.5 million barrels a day. That was government owned, and that production has fallen by about 2/3 since the oil is basically running out. So there's public ownership everywhere, including in the United States, but it's a relatively smaller portion. Yeah. Okay, so let me ask the first question. We're talking about the natural resource curse. Let me just ask a simple question first. If you could choose your country, you're going to be the king of your country, and you can choose to have natural resources in your country or not. What are you going to choose? So you're going to choose to have a lot of oil in your country, or would you choose not to have a lot of oil in your country? I'm just curious. Okay. Well, this is why this class is going to be fun, because I heard about half yes and half no. So this chart here gets to some of the. Hi, how you doing? This gets to one of the most interesting questions you can just immediately jump into in economics, and this is a chart that shows share of primary exports in manufacturing exports on the x-axis, and it shows average per capita income growth for the last 30 years on the y-axis. And what you see is this is a distribution of countries around the world, and we have data, so we have Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Bolivia, Indonesia over here. So these countries have high primary exports. They export some raw material over here, and then we have income growth, and what you see is a slight downward slope to the line. So what that would say is, other things being equal, having more primary resources is actually associated with somewhat slower economic growth. Now you're probably scratching your head. Some of you who've been studying natural resource economics and development economics are very familiar with this phenomenon, but many of you may not be familiar with this. And so I'm going to just describe what is called the natural resource curse. And this goes back, it's really only been about 20 years that people have been talking about the natural resource curse. But this goes back to work Robert Barra was doing in the early 1990s. He was estimating regression equations, trying to explain the sources of economic growth in economic development. And I don't know if you know, but he wrote some very nice papers and of course, as I said, I did econometrics as one of my fields, and so he's got a couple of papers in the American Economic Review in the early 1990s called I Just Ran 2,000 Regression Equations Explaining Growth, and if you saw that paper, and then 2 years later there was another one that said I just ran 4,000 more regression equations to estimate the sources of economic growth. But he was looking at what variables could explain economic growth. And he had cross-country data set and so on. And what he found was whenever he would put in natural resource endowment as a right-hand side variable, it came up with a negative sign in terms of economic growth. And so that was kind of interesting. At the same time, we had institutional economists who were looking at some of the factors that would affect economic growth, and they were finding also, there were some severe institutional problems in countries that had a lot of natural resources, had governance issues and so on. So this is basically the beginning of the discovery of the natural resource curse. And basically it's based on the observation that countries like Angola, Nigeria, Sudan, Congo are all rich in oil or diamonds or minerals, but they have relatively low per capita income levels. And the counterpoint, of course, is that countries like Japan and Korea and Taiwan have virtually no natural resources that can be exported, but they've had very good export performance and very good economic growth for the last 40 years. So that's the basis of the debate, and there's been a lot written about this the last 20 years. So my friend Joe Stiglitz and Jeffrey Sachs and Danny Roderick and Carmen Reinhardt and so on, one of my former colleagues at the IMF, Carmen, have all written about this, and many other people. I'm sure some of you have been writing papers on the natural resource curse. Now, let me just ask this question. This seems like a paradox, and what are some reasons why having more natural resources could actually hold back your rate of economic growth? I'm curious. Yes?
Plunder is an option if you have many natural.
Say again?
Okay, plunder is an option if you have a lot of natural resources at hand.
Plunder.
How powerful to plunder it at the expense of the others.
Okay. Other arguments? Yes, over here.
I think it's because it's a matter of incentives. When you have a lot of natural resources, you have less incentives to develop other industries, but the natural resources actually have fluctuate a lot. Most of the times are commodities, so you're more exposed to shocks.
More exposed to shocks, price shocks, yes, over here.
Corrupt and inefficient government.
Official corruption, always a concern. Yes, here. Yes.
Manufacturing and other services might have more learning by doing or incentive.
Okay, so
Value added in exports.
say again.
Low value added in
Lower value added in exports, yes.
It also brings a power for the government and makes government corrupted.
Exactly. Yes?
Well, from the whole generally Philippine perspective, it employs, more people, and they earn smaller salaries, and so it consumes most of the services of the economy, and it distracts more and more resources of the economy towards that sector. It's not a very high-paying job.
Absolutely. Yes, over here.
Makes people a bit lazy.
Makes people lazy.
Because they don't have to innovate much. They have a lot of money, so it's for them it's.
Yeah.
It's like marginal utility, like water and lemon paradox, something marginal.
Yes? In here? Okay. I would say you basically have the story right, and I'm just going to put up a few of my explanations here, and you basically have them. It makes you dependent on a single source of revenue. It can lead to income inequality. You can have high volatility of a natural resource that can make your economy, your macroeconomy, very volatile. One of the things that happened in the 1960s was resource boards. So countries that produce like jute or rubber or whatever would band together to try to control the price a little bit, because otherwise their economies could be whipsawed up and down because of wild swings in natural resource prices. That was always a concern. But many of you have got right to the heart of the matter also. There's a risk of government mismanagement, there's a risk of corruption. There's one other part that no one mentioned, and that really gets into the concept of Dutch disease. Can anyone explain Dutch disease? Yes.
When the reserves have found that the exchange rate appreciates significantly, economically, and then the transition.
And
And then it has a negative impact to the economy, right? The sharp appreciation of the exchange rates.
exactly. One of the things that yes?
I think that even more important is that as the oil sector develops, other sectors in the economy die out. Because all resources, efforts are all focused in the one sector.
Yeah, these are all, you're all giving the right answers here. These are all part of the concerns. One of the things that interests me, the Dutch disease, you're correct. It's named after the discovery of natural gas in the Netherlands in the 1970s, and it led to a strong appreciation of the guilder, which then led to a loss of competitiveness of other manufactured goods for the country, so they suffered. Many people would say Dutch disease has another aspect to it also, which is it makes a lot of revenue come into the government, and it gets the government very used to giving out social welfare payments or benefits that people then get used to, and then the government can't take them back, so that's considered also part of Dutch disease. It's been very interesting to me, we think of these as like developing country issues, but in the last 6 months I was asked to write a paper on this for Israel, because Israel has been finding a lot of gas in the Leviathan field, and so they're very worried about Dutch disease. And let me just put up a chart. This is terms of trade of Canada and Australia. Australia is at the top. And what you can see is both these countries are also suffering from Dutch disease. These are both very natural resource rich countries that are doing a lot of exporting of natural resources. So that's great. While you can export iron ore or oil or energy from Canada, it's very good in the short run, but it makes your currency appreciate, and so it really does undermine the competitiveness of your industrial sector and your manufacturing sector. Anyway, this is a pretty quick discussion of the resource curse. I just wanted to put on your plate, we had a reading, in the reading packet I had a paper by Jeffrey Frankel on the natural resource curse. It's a very nice overview paper a couple years ago of kind of the latest thinking on what's going on in the natural resource curse. There are two new papers also, just in 2013, that are on this. One is Cotet and Sui, 2013 paper. They look at the association between oil abundance and violence, coup attempts, and political violence in countries. They actually find little evidence of a correlation between oil endowment and those factors. They do find, however, that oil tends to increase military spending. And then there's another new paper out by Caselli and Michaels, 2013. This is a very nice paper. It's the American Economic Review, the Journal of Macroeconomics that they have. They had a nice data set from Brazilian municipalities that had oil finds. And so they did an analysis of what happens to the revenue in these Brazilian municipalities. And they found that there was some boosting of spending on public goods and services, infrastructure, and so on. But they found that household income in places that had oil did not go up hardly at all. And so they found basically billions and billions of dollars of money that disappeared. And so this paper basically supports the corruption effect. They said these funds disappeared. They went to the government officials who were in charge of things, and the money kind of frittered away, and no one's quite sure where the money went to. So kind of interesting, and I point you to those two papers if you're interested in the resource curse. Two nice pieces of research. Anyway, I said that this was going to be kind of a quick story on the natural resource curse. So I just wanted to put that out there. If some of you have not been thinking about that, it's a very interesting topic and a hot topic today. Yes?
I just want to add something.
Yes.
You always said. There's also this debate about the relation of natural resources and democracy.
Yes.
Other than economic development. And Darnas large a lot in last month about this issue, and it's very nice in his blog, Why Nations Fail. Nice to just let people go and read about the relation of natural resources and democracy.
Very hot topic these days. Excellent, excellent. So, what I'd like to do now is move on to core. Yes, one more thing in the back. Yes.
Sorry, because here,
Yes.
the question
Say that in the microphone. What you just said about the blog.
Okay, the blog War Nations Fail by Darnas. I think you all know that. So So yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay, so what I'd like to do now is move on to kind of the core microeconomics of oil pricing, okay? And let me just start with a basic picture. This is the historical price of oil for the last century, okay? And oil was basically flat until the 1970s. There's a little bump up there in World War I, but for the most part, oil prices were flat for most of the last century. Until the 1970s, and basically the last 40 years, we've seen very volatile oil prices. Oil was, less than $10 a barrel in 1972, and basically we've had a series of oil shocks where the price of oil has tripled. It has collapsed back down, it's fallen by 2/3, it's tripled again, and so on. And we just have some listing of some geopolitical events here, but the 1973 Arab embargo, we have the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the spiking of oil in 1980. 1986, OPEC introduces production quotas for the first time. 1999, OPEC cuts oil production quotas. And so basically, I just wanted you to get the picture in your mind that oil prices have been very volatile. Now, let me ask, yes?
Do you know maybe the data for real oil prices in this period?
Yeah, we can look at this in real terms. It doesn't fundamentally change the picture, but certainly economists would want to look at it both in nominal terms and in real terms. And that was nominal terms right there. Now, let me just, I want to ask just an opening question, and that is oil a competitively priced commodity? Some of you say you're doing microeconomic theory. I'm just curious. What's the opinion of the class?
Pretty much yes.
Pretty much?
Yes.
Pretty much yes. Okay. Other opinions? Yes?
Not really, actually. Like OPEC is having a huge influence on oil prices.
He says no, OPEC has a huge influence on oil prices. Okay. Other opinions? Ben?
I just think looking at the graph, it's not perfectly competitively priced because otherwise we wouldn't see the tags. This is when OPEC started their quotas and this is when they stopped it.
Okay. So we have a difference of opinion, but many people, one says it's competitively priced, some others say not competitively priced. OPEC is a cartel. Any other comments? Ben?
I think the Saudis play market maker. I think they've got a target price in mind.
They have a target price in mind. So that would suggest not competitively priced. If the largest producer in the world has a target price in mind, that would suggest probably not. Okay, got it. By the way, Saudi Arabia's production in the last 20 years has gone everything from 12 million barrels a day to 3 million barrels a day. I mean, we've had wide swings of, just for example, Saudi production, just for example. Well, I would argue with you today that oil is not competitively priced. So we're going to have a debate here, I can see. But we have many of the classic qualities in oil that we find in uncompetitive markets. We have lack of substitutes. We have very long-lived assets that use oil. Who knows how long the average automobile is on the road? In my country, at least in the US. You know how long the average automobile is on the road? 16. But it's longer than you think is the answer. What's that? You're giving trucks? Okay, trucks. Okay. So 12 for trucks, 16 for automobiles, and so on. These long-lived assets use oil. We do have restrictions on new entrants in many cases. We have, another thing that we have is getting back to this public ownership of resources. We have issues like national patrimony. I need to keep some oil in the ground for the children and our children's children. So we shouldn't pump oil today. By the way, who knows what Hotelling said in 1931 about the optimal pump rate of oil? If you had oil in the ground, he thought about this quite a bit. He said, what's the rate at which you should pump oil if you have oil in the ground? You know what he said? Yeah, Ben?
He says that the rate of output falls over time, such that the price rate rises, that's where the rate of interest local rationales.
Exactly. He says that you should basically pump at the rate of interest. So I can, if just suppose you get $100 for a barrel, if I can pump $100 today and I earn interest of 3%, a year from now, well, I could have $103 a year from now. So you can see quickly why that would be a basic theory. He would say that you should pump at the rate of interest. Kind of interesting. We do have a series. I just have a chart here that talks about some of the factors that do affect national governments. When national governments own oil, some of the considerations that may make this not be a competitive market. Many of them will impose severance taxes on oil. Now you say, well, they have the right to impose severance taxes if it's their oil. But if you say oil was $60 and $70 and then $80, and you say, everyone's demanding oil, it's in demand, I'm going to increase my severance tax by another $20. I mean, this is basically a lot of what has been going on the last 10 years. Countries may set quotas or limits on oil. They may not accept bids for production under any circumstances. Now, a free market, competitive market would say, if Exxon wants to knock on your door and say, may I pay you $80 a barrel to pump your oil, they should at least be allowed to knock on your door and give you a price. If your answer is no, we don't care. If you're Exxon, you're not allowed to bid. Well, that's getting to be a characteristic, let's say, of a non-competitive market, or a market that has some behavior other than a normal competitive market. One of the things that is interesting is production may be limited due to environmental concerns. And so in the U.S., for example, we do have oil, and the U.S. is not a free market either. So I'm putting the U.S. in the same exact category as many countries. If Exxon says, we think there's an oil deposit off the coast of Virginia and would like to drill for it, they're basically told by the government, that's an environmentally sensitive area. We're worried about pollution or oil spill. You're not allowed to drill there. You're not even allowed to bid for it. So even in the U.S., we take oil deposits out of circulation just for these reasons. Also, of course, there can be rent-seeking behavior also. And some countries may require bribes in order to even make a bid to produce oil. And I hope this is not shocking to people to think that might occur somewhere in the world. Other countries may subsidize oil prices for trading friends. They may say, oh, for you, the price of oil is $40 a barrel. For you, it's $80 a barrel. Oh, for you, it's $120 a barrel. And of course, there are countries in the world that do that as well. So this, again, is a characteristic of a market that's not a normal, competitively priced product. What is a cartel, by the way? Exactly. This is a group of producers who agree to constrain supply to affect the price. And clearly, by definition, this is basically the definition of what OPEC is. Now, OPEC does not produce 100% of the oil in the world, but this would be a characteristic of a cartel when the group forms and says, our purpose is to control the price of oil or to set production quotas. That would be a characteristic of an oligopoly or some sort of monopolistic power, not necessarily complete. And my view is that it is not complete. It is a partial monopolist power, but that's my view. And you know this here. Right. Here I show this is a chart that shows these are the production quotas of OPEC for the last 30 years. And what's interesting is this data here, which is, this is the period when oil prices went to from $70 a barrel to $147 a barrel, back down to 35, back up to 70, and then back up to $120 a barrel. So basically, over a period of very rapidly shifting conditions, the OPEC production quota was not changed. So it does suggest that there is there are decisions that are being made that are not necessarily reacting to day-to-day market movements. So I just put this out there. Now, questions, a very simple question. What is the source of OPEC's power? They have, and it's Anna, right? Anna said it perfectly. She said they have access to most of the easy oil. And that was a very, very well put. Basically, this chart here shows that OPEC is responsible or has control over 77% of the market, of the endowment of easy oil. Yes? Yes, go ahead. Did you want to ask a question? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, we know that actually cartel is illegal, but OPEC is a well-known cartel. I mean, I do not understand. Why is it allowed to exist, this cartel?
Okay, well, it's, yeah, I would say you got a very good answer in 5 words. Who would sue them and where? So basically, who would sue them and where? Are you going to make an appeal to the International Energy Agency? You're going to file a complaint? Are you going to, you get the idea. Who would sue them and where? And what court, and who would basically enforce?
How they would enforce a decision if there would be any.
Exactly. Now, think about, to me, one of the things I like to do in thinking about oil pricing, I like to think about a step-shaped supply curve, okay? And this gets to Anna's point about cheap oil. Think about a production curve that is a step-shaped supply curve. Think about if we could produce the cheapest oil in the world first, and produce as much of that as we had, and then we had to move on to the second cheapest oil, and we produced that second, and then we produced the third cheapest oil third, and so on. And this might give you an indication. This is data from 2009. By the way, getting oil production cost data is extremely difficult. I have had CEOs from major oil companies look you in the face and say, oh, production costs in the tar sands in Canada, that's $60 a barrel. And others will say, no, it's $45 a barrel. And others will say, oh, I think it's about $80 a barrel. So it is extremely difficult to know exactly what is the production cost, especially in some of these unconventional places. And that's the first thing I want to say. So this here is Dan Jurgen's group, CIRA, Cambridge Energy Research Associate estimates of a couple years ago. But think of the following. The world's using about 86, 87 million barrels a day of oil. And think about a world where you did this in logical fashion, where you produce look like. And you'd say, okay, this is all the oil in the world. We need 86 million barrels. We're producing the 86 millionth barrel at because we're going to now move on. Now imagine Saudi Arabia said, you know, we've actually got these big oil fields here, and we've got other fields over there that we could develop if we just chose to. It wouldn't even cost that much to develop those other oil fields, but we're going to choose to develop them now. And suppose they could just double their production or increase by 50% their production, or other Middle East countries could produce their costs of production. By the way, most people will think $20 would cover fine production costs in the Middle East. It's probably even quite a bit less than that, but just suppose $20 a barrel. If they could produce more, this little scenario here assumes that Saudi Arabia is up 25% and other Middle East countries up 50%. That would put more low steps on the supply curve, right? So maybe by the time we get to 85 billion barrels a day, we might only be producing at, say, $60 a barrel. So this is just a way of thinking about the price of oil. And let's go one step further. Imagine they said, actually, we're going to cut our production. Saudi Arabia and the Middle East said, we're going to cut our production. So if they cut their production down 50%, other Middle East production down 50%, suddenly the whole thing shifts to the right, And maybe there's some really expensive production out here by the time you get to 85 million barrels a day. And maybe by the time you get to 85 million barrels, maybe you're at $200 a barrel. So this is I'm just giving you kind of a framework for thinking about the pricing of oil. But this is the way I think about the pricing of oil. And I know that Saudi Arabia wanted to produce more oil. They could. I know they have more oil in the ground. They could shift the curve to the right if they chose to. Okay, there are multiple factors that OPEC considers in setting prices, of course. And one that's increasingly a factor is the revenue requirements of governments. Arab Spring was a big wake-up call for many countries in the Middle East. And it led many countries to see revolution in the streets and governments being overthrown. And it led many governments to say, you know, we really don't want that to happen here. One of the first things we want to do, we know we have a youth unemployment problem, for example. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to put a subsidy, or we're going to give some tax payments, or suddenly everyone who's 20 years old can have free tuition at university, or whatever it's going to be that they want to do because they're worried about maybe some of these kinds of political risks. They will increase their social spending, so additional subsidies for whatever, health care, for labor grants, for scholarships for education, and so on, to try to make people happier so that they don't have revolutions. And we have some estimates, and there are a lot of people in the world who think about what are the revenue requirements of the government of Saudi Arabia, of the government of Kuwait, of the government of Iran, of the government of, you name it, down the road. So again, there are a lot of people who think about revenue requirements. And this chart here is a representation of some recent estimates of what some political analysts think are the revenue requirements of some of the key Middle Eastern oil producers. And so many of these numbers crunch around $60, $70, $80 a barrel. Some of them are $100 a barrel. So the governments actually need $100 a barrel in order to fulfill their social spending needs. So this is one way of thinking about a factor that affects production quotas and revenue. Yes?
Does this include is this the government budget, so you have also military expenditures in that?
These are total government requirements, total government revenue requirements, exactly. And so there are some military spending assumptions in here.
Yeah, because I mean, military spending in Saudi Arabia is huge, right?
Yeah. Okay. So there's one other thing I'd like to put on your attention, and this goes back to a paper 1952 by von Stackelberg, who was thinking about profit maximizing behavior of partial monopolists. To me, this gets to the heart of the OPEC pricing decision. To me, OPEC is a partial monopolist. It is not a full monopolist. And so this is a nice way of thinking about the pricing behavior of a partial monopolist. And what this says, this is the profit maximizing price that the partial monopolist can charge. It's a function of the cost of producing oil in a competitive market. So think of this as like what the true marginal cost of the 86 millionth barrel of oil is. And we have to modify it by three factors. One is the price elasticity of demand, the beta. The sigma is the market share. And the mu here is a price responsiveness of competitors. So think of this as the non-OPEC supply response, or supply elasticity. And let's think about this for a minute. What does this say? Well, this says that we have, whatever the competitive price of oil is, if there's a lot of, if demand is really inelastic, I can push the envelope some. If there's really inelastic demand for my good, I can push the envelope some. I can overcharge for a while and get more revenue. I can charge above the competitive cost. Another factor is, again, come back to that market share. Suppose OPEC is 1% of world production. And they could be a cartel, but if they're 1% of world production, does it matter?
Yeah, no.
Not really. So the market share matters. And then the third factor that matters is the supply elasticity, okay? If the price goes up and a bunch of non-OPEC producers say, well, I'd be happy to supply oil, even if it goes up 1 penny, I'll supply 1-for-1 oil. So that would tend to make you not be able to charge a whole lot more than C. So I'm just giving you this framework. What we're going to do is we're going to use this equation. We're going to trace out a pricing profile for OPEC. Now, yes?
Just if you could return to the previous equation. But doesn't it say that if market share of partial monopolies increases,
yeah,
the maximizing price should decrease? Kind of. Intuitive sense would say that even partial monopolies would set higher price than competitive. While this formula.
Maybe there should be a minus sign here. I'm trying to think because it needs to go above. Say again? Yeah, I'm sorry. Beta is negative. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Beta is negative. Yeah. So price elasticity would be minus 0.05 or something like that for oil. So let's talk about elasticities now for a minute. And these are a range of, this is kind of central tendency. These numbers are in the green paper that I assigned for reading. And these are some middle-of-the-road estimates of elasticity, of price elasticity of demand and supply elasticity And what we see is in the short run, let's talk about the short run price elasticity. A high value might be minus 0.09, and a low estimate might be minus 0.7, call it, 0.07. So are these high or low elasticities? These are incredibly low elasticities, right? I mean, there's almost nothing in the world that has as low an elasticity as these kinds of numbers here. In the longer run, the price elasticities are higher. They can be a 0.45 or a 0.6, and that would be long run. But what's one of the reasons why elasticities are so low for oil? Short run elasticities. Anya? Lack of substitutes? I mean, yes? Infrastructure? Yes, back here?
Demand, the way, your preferences for the products, they don't change very easily, very quickly in response to.
So, you're all correct. These things are these are broad societal choices that we make. So, even these have to do with land use. It has to do, I think of America, I know this case the best in the United States. People live in the suburbs, they live 40 miles away from their job, they're used to getting in their car and driving to work every day. There's an oil shock and the price of oil doubles. So the price of gasoline doubles. And suddenly you're living 40 miles away from your job and you say, well, I want to cut back on my oil use. I want to cut, and you're like, well, are you going to go to work on Monday? If you don't, you're going to lose your job. Then you have zero income. That's not good. And so these factors are everything from, I just bought a new truck, last month that gets 12 miles a gallon. I thought oil prices would stay low. Oh, I was wrong. I have by the way, the average vehicle is, Americans have average per capita family income is about $48,000. After tax, about $36,000. Vehicle is $25,000. The average vehicle costs the average household about 2/3 of a year's income. And so you can't just walk away from a vehicle when it's equivalent of most of a year's work. And so the price doubles. I have to go to work on Monday. I have to go to the gas tank and fill up, the gas station, fill up my car and go to work. I don't have a choice. And so basically, you've got the answer right. I mean, the capital doesn't change. The vehicle, you can't snap your fingers and make the vehicle into a Prius, a Toyota Prius that gets 50 miles a gallon. You're locked into it. You're locked into where you live, and you need to get to work on Monday. So these are some of the factors. Yes.
I find it honestly surprising that there isn't more of a reaction to carpool. I mean, that's a very quick, easy action.
There are.
And I live in Houston, or near
Okay.
Houston, and so that's just, so many cars off the road. If you just poor people call for one other person.
Right, and it's exactly for reasons like carpooling that it's not zero. Okay, I mean, someone out there, the price doubles, they do say, you know, it's really inconvenient, but please swing by and pick me up, and then I'll drive you tomorrow to work. And so it is exactly some of those factors. Yes, you're going to say.
No, I just want, basically the same. It's like the option is collaborative consumption.
Yeah, I can ride the bus. Maybe some people can leave their car at home and ride the bus. But many people probably don't live on a bus route, and so if they're going to get to work, they have to drive their car. Anyway, you get the idea. What we're going to do now, and then we have the supply is also very low. And again, the argument is basically the same. You know, just because the price of oil goes up 10%, you know, I can't just snap my fingers and suddenly have more production coming tomorrow. I can invest in a well, I can invest, I can whatever, but I can't make very much oil in one day or in short term. And the supply responses also are very low, something like 0.08 or 0.12, something like that. These are the estimates of high and low range for supply. What we're going to do now, and this I think is the most interesting part of the Green paper, again, that was on the reading list. What Green does is he uses the equation to sketch out pricing ranges for OPEC oil. So assume you're a partial monopolist, assume that OPEC is a partial monopolist, and assume those elasticities of demand and supply. Let's sketch out a price range of what we might be seeing in terms of OPEC pricing. And what he does here, these two bands at the bottom, these are assuming the long-term price elasticity and long-term supply response. And this line here, from here to here, sketches out the short-term elasticity. So that's a range, because there's some uncertainty of what the true elasticity of demand is, okay? So this is just reflects a little uncertainty, but these are the ranges. So what do we see? And by the way, on the x-axis is OPEC market share, and on the y-axis is the price of oil, $2,009 per barrel. So here we do have oil in real terms, by the way. Okay, so we started in 1965. 65, so each dot is the year. 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73. So basically, OPEC was underpricing oil. OPEC existed in the 1960s, but it was not a very effective cartel in the 1960s to early 70s. And so OPEC was, let's call it, underpricing its oil until 1973. 1973, the price of oil shoots up. Here it is, 1974. So the price of oil is above the long-term desired range, shall we say, but below the short-term profit-maximizing price range. If you trace it throughout the 70s, it goes up 1979, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84. OPEC was basically pricing right at the fringe of its ability to exploit its market power. What does this say? Let's cut this to the chase. We're saying there's an inelastic demand for my product. I know you don't have very many good choices. You have to get to work on Monday. So if I really want to screw you, I could basically just double the price and get a bunch more revenue in the short run, because I know you have to get to work and you have to pay it. And so this is basically, and think of this line here as high as you can go to stay in business, so to speak. Okay, so basically this is what OPEC did in the 1980, 81, 79, 80, 81, 82. Oil prices, but what happened as OPEC raised its price very high? What was happening to the OPEC share? Again, this is OPEC market share. This is 45%, 50%. Okay, as OPEC raised its prices, it lost market share. So this is 1980, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84. Gee, by the time we get here, OPEC's only producing 25% of oil in the world. This was Saudi Arabia's production falling from 10 million barrels a day to 3 million barrels a day. It was losing market share because it was too expensive. It was getting too close to the pricing point where it couldn't sustain a profit. It could not sustain that price. So it was cutting its It was losing market share because it was overcharging, if you want to think. Prices collapsed in 85, 86, and for a long period through the late 1980s to 1990s, OPEC was pricing in, let's call it the long-term profit maximizing range. It was a sustainable price. By the way, what happens if you overcharge for too long? What happens? New entrants could come in and take market share away, so that's one of the things that happen. What else can happen if you overcharge for too long? People will develop new ways of getting to work. They will actually sell that big truck that gets 12 miles a gallon, and they'll buy a Toyota Prius. And so these are the things that will happen if you overcharge. That's one of the reasons why your share goes down, is people do respond over time. Today, we're basically back up. This is 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, and we're basically right back at this range again. And so I would say OPEC, again, is right at the fringe. It's probably pressing its luck in terms of its pricing. It's basically right at the top of its possible range, exploiting the short-term, the very low short-term elasticity of demand. Okay? Again, I'm just giving us a framework of thinking about oil pricing. So, what are the key lessons from von Stackelberg for OPEC and oil prices? Again, I asked this question: if you overcharge consistently for your oil, what will happen? And we basically said that. If you overcharge consistently for your oil, first of all, you may cause a global recession to hurt demand for your oil. You may lose market share. You may encourage technical innovation to replace your oil. And you may encourage consumer governments to shift policies. They might put an import fee on your oil, for example, and they may mandate more fuel efficiency for their cars. So these are the things that will happen if you overcharge consistently. Next question, and this is, we have some people from oil producing countries here, so this is a question for you. If you want to maximize your revenue over a number of years, it could be a good idea to what? Yes?
Keep prices really low in the beginning and develop demand for it, get people's habits set into it, and then raise prices.
That's true, but there's actually a twist to this. What else do you really want to do? Yes?
I'd say not to exploit all reserves at once.
You can exploit your oil reserves at once, but think about a game... Not to exploit them at once. Okay, got it. Think about a game theory situation. Think about a game theory situation, and you want to exploit your advantage, but you have a temporary advantage. You don't have a permanent advantage over the demand side. So what do you do? Yes?
Constantly innovate like in technology and cut down your costs significantly.
You can do that. You can do that. Keep your costs down. Yes?
So you charge as much as you can, just below the point where other competitors might come.
You want to do that? Yes, you're close. You're all getting very close to the answer, but there's one answer which is superior. Yes, go ahead.
Do you try to, just looking at the graph before, do you try to make the price volatile for a while, charge high, low?
Yes, you get an A, because that's what you want to do. Basically, the lesson coming out of this equation here is what you want to do is you want to grab demand when you can get it. You want to basically grab as much as you can, go up to that line for some period of years, but basically you got to be careful. If you go too high, too long, and you really encourage the people using your product to change their technology, you flew too close to the sun. And so think about an optimal pricing strategy. So this is my answer. You want to exploit the low short-term price elasticity for oil. You basically want variable prices. You would actually like a price to be high most years, but low some years to devalidate investments that others are making in alternatives. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, but how come governments cannot anticipate this and start allocating funds for that to get an alternative technology?
Well, I mean, you're talking about the oil producers? Or
U.S. government, for example.
Yeah.
Do you think they are allocating enough funds?
No, and we're going to get to that in a minute, because we're going to get to the whole policy side of this in a minute. We're laying a base for the policy discussion here. I would argue, I would submit to you that the optimal pricing profile for OPEC in a 5-year period would be $100, $100, $100, $100, $30. $100, $100, $100, $100, $30. Okay, why do I need the $30?
It will be more expensive to innovate and to keep buying oil.
Yes. What is my goal here? Someone out there is investing billions of dollars to develop an electric car, to develop a tar sands, a very expensive tar sands project. Someone out there is the CEO of an oil company, and he's going to his board of directors and saying, I would like to invest $4 billion in an oil sands project. It will cost $80 a barrel to produce this oil, but I think the price of oil is going to stay high, and you should approve this investment. And what does OPEC want? OPEC wants
competition.
They want that CEO to get fired the next board meeting. He invests $4 billion of the company's money. They start investing like crazy in the Canadian tar sands. And then the price of oil drops to $30 a barrel for a year. And the board of directors go to the CEO and say, you're fired. You wasted $4 billion of money. This was a stupid investment. And we're going to fire you and shut down the project. And not only that, but the electric car company, you know, Carlo Ghosn of Nissan Renault, you know, they want him to be fired because he's investing in electric cars, and say, why did you ever think to invest in electric cars? Didn't you know that gasoline is $1 a gallon today? And so that is, so I submit to you, there's different thinking about what is an optimal pricing strategy, but that's my optimal pricing strategy. Yes, in the back.
This pricing strategy has a twist.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if you do it sufficiently, regularly, for a sufficient time, so that you know, I being a shareholder, okay, it's $30 just for a year. If you do it, I mean, regularly and simply, you build kind of a regularity that on average the price is like $90. So it's just, okay, we know it's just $30 for a year.
Yeah. So the secret, you're exactly right, of course. I don't really want to do 100, 100, 100, 130, 100, 100, 100, 130. I really want to do 100, 120, 100, 125.
It doesn't matter.
100, 100.
Okay, those fluctuations are. Okay, average out. It's like everyone averages $80. Okay, you have pretty much some time.
Yeah. Is there another point here? Yes.
So, I mean, in effect, from game theory perspective, if you're a partial monopolist and you want to demonstrate your ability, you don't demonstrate it by constantly charging close to the margin. You demonstrate it by charging whatever you want to show at any given point. So you establish credibility by doing as much erratic and as much at will behavior as you can, not by not by pattern or not by approaching with models.
The only trouble
Exactly. I agree completely with what you just said. You want to establish erratic behavior that no one can predict, and you want to put out there the possibility. What are you trying to achieve? You're trying to achieve. Think of 12 people sitting around the board table, the board of directors meeting at ExxonMobil, and Rex Tillerson, the CEO, is really saying, I want to invest $4 billion in this project. You want to inject enough doubt and unpredictability so that those 12 people who have to approve this $4 billion investment, that at least 4 or 5 of them would say, well, that sounds risky to me. And then one says, oh, I feel certain that oil could go at least down to $50 a barrel. It wouldn't be worth it. So you want to inject uncertainty, unpredictability, so that you cast doubt and you can block a $4 billion investment to, say, develop an alternative source of energy. Exactly. Very interesting point. She says you can cover this kind of risk with using derivatives in financial markets. I agree partially with what you said. I can cover some risk for some period of time, but the ability to, here's the problem. Someone out there is making a decision to build a new power plant that has a life of 40 years, and they're trying to decide what energy to use. I can't use derivatives to insulate me for 40 years. I can't use it to insulate me for even 20 years, or even 10 years. Well, in know, effectively, Southwest Airlines, for example, gets the gold star for being most effective at hedging against the increase of oil prices like in 2008. You know, these are smart people, but they have, first of all, there's a cost of using derivatives. You know, they basically insulated themselves for about a year and a half from an oil price spike. You know, in theory, maybe one could for some period of time, but the markets are not very deep. As you go out beyond 1 year to 2 years, the markets are not very deep. The derivative coverage is going to cost you more and more as you go out 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And the whole problem here is many people are making investments that have a 40-year lifespan. So you can't, the markets are not deep enough. The derivative markets, in my opinion, are not deep enough to really insulate you against the real risks.